Picture this: a man standing in his own driveway, holding a piece of paper that would completely obliterate 5 years of harassment, threats, and thousands of dollars in fines. The HOA president's face drained of all color as she realized her entire reign of terror was built on a lie. A neighborhood of silent witnesses finally erupts in applause as justice crashes down like a hammer. This is the story of Marcus Chen, a software engineer who bought his dream home only to discover he'd moved next door to the most vindictive, power-hungry HOA president in suburban history. For half a decade, she made his life a living nightmare over 6 inches of alleged property encroachment. She fined him relentlessly. She threatened legal action. She turned neighbors against him. She even tried to force him to demolish part of his home. But what she didn't know was that Marcus had been quietly, methodically building a case that would expose not just her mistake, but her corruption, her abuse of power, and her complete disregard for the truth. Where are you watching from? Please feel free to leave a comment below, as you are about to witness one of the most satisfying property dispute takedowns you'll ever see. Because when the surveyor's final report came in, it didn't just prove Marcus was in the right. It proved the HOA president's own fence was illegally built on community property, her shed violated 3 separate codes, and she had been collecting fines under pretenses for years. What happened next? Let's say some people's empires are built on sand, and this one was about to wash away. Marcus Chen had spent 15 years climbing the ladder in Silicon Valley, working brutal hours, sacrificing weekends, and saving every penny he could. His dream wasn't extravagant by tech industry standards. He didn't want a mansion or a penthouse. He wanted something simpler, something that represented everything he'd never had growing up. A real home with a yard, in a quiet neighborhood where he could finally breathe. When he found the house on Willowbrook Drive in 2018, it felt like destiny. A charming 3-bedroom craftsman with a detached garage, mature oak trees in the backyard, and a neighborhood that looked like it had been pulled straight from a magazine about suburban tranquility. The streets were clean, the lawns were manicured. Children played on sidewalks while parents waved to each other from porches. The HOA seemed reasonable enough during the buying process. The fees were standard, about $200 a month, and the covenants looked like typical suburban stuff. No boats parked in driveways, lawns maintained, trash cans out of sight except on collection days. Marcus had never lived in an HOA community before, but his real estate agent assured him this one was well-run and non-intrusive. What Marcus didn't know during those optimistic closing days was that Willowbrook Estates HOA was in transition. The longtime president, a retired accountant named Harold, who'd run things with a light touch for 2 decades, had recently stepped down due to health issues. And into that power vacuum had stepped someone who would transform the entire character of the neighborhood. Her name was Patricia Drummond, and she lived in the largest house on the block, directly adjacent to Marcus's property. Patricia was in her late 50s, recently divorced, with 2 adult children who'd long since moved away. She'd lived in Willowbrook for 12 years but had never been particularly involved in community affairs until Harold's departure created an opportunity. Are you starting to see where this is going? Have you ever dealt with someone who treats a tiny amount of authority like they've been crowned royalty? Patricia ran for HOA president on a platform of restoring standards and property values. In the beginning, some residents appreciated her attention to detail. She organized a neighborhood cleanup day. She negotiated a better landscaping contract for the common areas. She updated the community website. But within months, something shifted. The attention to detail became obsessive micromanagement. The concern for property values became a weapon, and Patricia seemed to develop a particular fixation on Marcus's property. It started 3 months after he'd moved in. Marcus came home from work one Tuesday evening to find a formal notice taped to his front door. His heart sank as he read it. According to the HOA, his detached garage was encroaching on the property setback line by approximately 6 inches. The notice demanded that he remedy the situation within 30 days or face fines of $100 per day. Marcus stared at the notice in confusion. The garage had been there for decades, built long before he'd purchased the property. How could something that existed during the sale suddenly be a violation? He walked around his property that evening, measuring distances with a tape measure, trying to understand what Patricia was talking about. The garage sat near the rear corner of his lot, a sturdy structure that had been well maintained by the previous owners. From what Marcus could tell with his amateur measurements, it was properly positioned. But he wasn't a surveyor, and the notice had rattled him enough that he wanted professional confirmation. The next day, Marcus called a licensed surveyor. The quote was $1,500 for a full boundary survey. It was a significant expense for something that seemed ridiculous, but the threat of $100 daily fines was terrifying. He scheduled the survey for 2 weeks out, which was the earliest available appointment. In the meantime, Marcus decided to do what any reasonable person would do: communicate. He sent Patricia a polite email explaining that he'd scheduled a survey, that the garage had existed long before his purchase, and that he was confident the survey would show everything complied. He asked if she could put any potential fines on hold until the survey results came back. But here's the question that should already be forming in your mind. What happens when someone is uninterested in being reasonable? What happens when the point isn't really about property lines at all? Patricia's response arrived within an hour. It was cold, formal, and inflexible. She stated that the HOA board had already reviewed the matter and determined a violation existed. The 30-day deadline stood. Any fines assessed would need to be paid regardless of survey results, as the violation existed in the present moment. She concluded by suggesting that if Marcus had concerns about the property's condition, he should have conducted proper due diligence before purchasing. Marcus read the email 3 times, his confusion deepening into something else: anxiety. The tone wasn't just professional, it was almost hostile. This wasn't how neighbors talk to each other, even in official HOA capacity. The survey took place on a sunny Saturday morning. Marcus watched as the surveying crew set up their equipment, took measurements, and marked boundaries with stakes and bright pink flagging tape. The lead surveyor, a weathered man named Bill, who'd been doing this work for 30 years, spent hours ensuring accuracy. When Bill finally approached Marcus with the preliminary findings, his expression was puzzled. According to his measurements, the garage wasn't just in compliance with setback requirements. It had more than 2 feet of clearance. It wasn't even close to a violation. Marcus felt relief flood through him, followed immediately by anger. Patricia had accused him of a violation that didn't exist. She'd put him through weeks of stress and cost him $1,500 for nothing. But Bill had noticed something else while conducting the survey, something that made his eyebrows raise. Patricia's property had its own issues. Her decorative privacy fence, the tall cedar structure that ran along the side of her property facing Marcus's home, appeared to encroach several inches onto Marcus's land. And her storage shed, positioned in her backyard near the property line, seemed to violate the same setback requirements she'd accused Marcus of breaking. Can you already feel the irony building? Can you sense the karmic justice just waiting to unfold? Marcus took the official survey report to the next HOA board meeting, confident that presenting clear evidence would resolve everything. The meeting was held in the community center, a small building near the neighborhood entrance. About a dozen residents attended, along with Patricia and the 4 other board members. When his turn came to speak, Marcus approached the front of the room and calmly explained the situation. He presented the survey, highlighting that his garage was fully compliant. He mentioned, almost as an afterthought, that the survey had revealed some concerns with Patricia's property instead. The room went silent. Every eye turned to Patricia. Her face had gone rigid, her jaw clenched. For a long moment she didn't speak, and Marcus thought she'd acknowledge the mistake, perhaps even apologize. Instead, Patricia smiled. It wasn't a warm smile. It was the smile of someone who'd just decided to go to war. She stated that she'd need to review the survey report more thoroughly with the HOA's legal counsel. She suggested that one survey wasn't necessarily conclusive, and that the board might want to commission its own independent assessment. She then pivoted smoothly into other business, effectively tabling Marcus's issue without resolution. Marcus left that meeting with a sinking feeling in his stomach. This wasn't about property lines. This had become something personal, something vindictive, and Patricia had just shown that she was willing to use every ounce of her authority to make his life difficult. He had no idea how right he was. The next 3 years turned Marcus's dream home into a source of constant stress and anxiety. Patricia's retaliation was systematic, creative, and relentless. She wielded the HOA covenants like a weapon, interpreting every rule in the most restrictive way possible whenever it concerned Marcus's property. It started with the smaller violations, things so petty they would have been laughable if they weren't costing him money. Marcus received a notice about his trash cans being visible from the street 30 minutes after collection time on a Tuesday morning. He'd been working from home and genuinely planned to bring them in during his lunch break. The fine was $50. 2 weeks later, another notice. His lawn was a 1/4 inch longer than the maximum height allowed in the covenants. Marcus had actually just mowed 3 days earlier, but a few patches near his trees had grown faster due to sprinkler coverage. Another $50 fine. Then came a citation about his mailbox. The black paint had started to chip slightly on one corner, which Patricia determined violated the aesthetic standards requiring all fixtures to be well-maintained and presentable. Marcus repainted the mailbox the same weekend, but the $75 fine still appeared in his HOA statement. Have you ever felt like you're being watched constantly, just waiting for you to make the tiniest mistake? Can you imagine what that does to a person's peace of mind? Marcus started documenting everything. He took photos of his property daily. He noted every time he performed maintenance. He kept meticulous records of his trash can schedule, his lawn care routine, and every detail of his property's condition. He was living like someone under surveillance because effectively he was. But Patricia's campaign went beyond just fines for minor infractions. She began attending city council meetings and filing complaints about Marcus's property with municipal code enforcement. These complaints alleged violations of city codes entirely separate from HOA rules, issues with drainage, tree maintenance, and even suggested his home office might be violating zoning restrictions on business operations in residential areas. Each complaint triggered an inspection by city officials, and each time the inspectors found nothing wrong. Marcus's property was in complete compliance with all municipal codes. But each inspection required Marcus to take time off work, prepare documentation, and endure the stress of having officials examine his home. The inspectors themselves started to recognize what was happening. One inspector actually apologized to Marcus, explaining off the record that they were legally obligated to respond to every complaint, even when they suspected the complaints were baseless. The financial toll was mounting. Between HOA fines and the costs of defending himself, Marcus had spent over $4,000 in the first year alone. He'd consulted with 2 attorneys about his options. Both said the same thing. Fighting an HOA in court was expensive, time-consuming, and unpredictable. Unless he could prove deliberate harassment with clear discriminatory intent, judges typically gave HOAs significant deference in enforcing their own rules. One lawyer suggested Marcus sell the house and move. The stress wasn't worth it, he said. Life was too short to fight these battles. But Marcus couldn't accept that. This was his home. He'd done nothing wrong. And selling would mean Patricia had won, that her abuse of power had succeeded in driving out a resident who'd defended himself with accurate information. So here's the question that changes everything. When do you decide enough is enough? When do you stop playing defense and start building something bigger? Marcus began researching HOA law with the same focused intensity he applied to debugging complex code at work. He spent nights and weekends reading case law, studying property law, and reviewing the HOA's governing documents with a legal dictionary beside him. He joined online forums where homeowners shared stories about HOA disputes and strategies for fighting back. What he discovered was disturbing. Patricia's interpretation of the HOA covenants was often stretched beyond any reasonable reading of the actual language. Some of her enforcement actions contradicted the HOA's own bylaws, and crucially, she'd been making decisions unilaterally without proper board votes on several matters. Marcus also learned something else through his research. HOA board members have fiduciary duties to the association. They're supposed to act in the best interests of all homeowners, not use their position for personal vendettas. If he could prove Patricia was abusing her authority for personal reasons, rather than legitimate HOA purposes, he might have grounds for legal action. He started filing formal complaints with the board about Patricia's conduct, using the proper procedures outlined in the HOA documents. He documented each instance where she'd enforced rules selectively, noting that other properties had similar or worse violations that went unaddressed. He pointed out that she'd been assessing fines without proper board votes, which the bylaws required for penalties over $50. The board's response was disappointing, but not surprising. The other 4 board members seemed either intimidated by Patricia or simply unwilling to challenge her. They'd rubber stamp her decisions with minimal discussion. Some residents whispered that Patricia had dirt on various board members, information about past violations she'd chosen not to pursue in exchange for loyalty. But Marcus's complaints did accomplish one thing. They created an official record. Every ignored complaint, every request for fair enforcement that went unanswered, every instance of Patricia's retaliation became part of the documented history. Marcus was building a case, even if he wasn't entirely sure what he'd ultimately do with it. Now, can you feel the tension building? Can you sense that something has to give? Year 2 brought escalation. Patricia filed a formal complaint with the HOA demanding that Marcus remove a decorative statue from his front yard that violated aesthetic guidelines. The statue was a traditional Chinese guardian lion that Marcus's grandmother had given him. It held deep personal and cultural significance. It was also, by any objective measure, tasteful and entirely appropriate for residential display. Several other homes in the neighborhood had similar lawn ornaments, religious statuary, and equally visible garden decorations. Marcus refused to remove it. Patricia responded by proposing a covenant amendment that would ban all non-traditional statuary from front yards. The proposal was transparently targeted at Marcus' lion statue, while being worded vaguely enough to give Patricia discretion about what counted as non-traditional. The covenant amendment required a vote of all homeowners. Patricia scheduled a community meeting to discuss the proposal. Marcus attended, preparing to defend not just his property, but his cultural heritage. What happened at that meeting became a turning point, though not in the way Patricia expected. Marcus spoke calmly but passionately about what the lion statue represented. He explained the cultural tradition, the personal significance, and the fact that it represented his family's heritage. He noted that several other homes had religious statuary, decorative flags, and garden ornaments that were being exempted from Patricia's proposed restriction. Then something unexpected happened. Other residents started speaking up. A woman named Jennifer, who lived 3 streets over, pointed out that Patricia's proposal would also ban her Virgin Mary statue. An older man named Tom noted that his wife's garden gnome collection would violate this new rule. Another resident asked why Patricia's elaborate Christmas decorations were acceptable, but Marcus' year-round cultural symbol was not. The meeting devolved into an argument. Residents who'd been quiet for years suddenly found their voices. Questions arose about other HOA enforcement decisions, other examples of selective application of rules. Someone brought up the fact that Patricia's own fence was still potentially encroaching on Marcus's property, an issue that had never been addressed. Patricia tried to regain control of the meeting, but the damage was done. When the vote came, the covenant amendment failed by a wide margin. Marcus kept his statue, and more importantly, cracks had appeared in Patricia's authority. But Patricia wasn't done. Not even close. If anything, the failed covenant amendment made her more determined. She commissioned her own property survey, presumably looking for ammunition she could use against Marcus. When that survey came back confirming Marcus complied, she refused to accept it. She hired a second surveyor. When that one also confirmed Marcus's property was fine, she suggested both surveyors were incompetent or possibly biased. The absurdity was becoming undeniable. Even board members who'd supported Patricia started questioning her judgment. But Patricia had one more card to play, one more escalation that would finally push things past the breaking point. She filed a lawsuit, not just against Marcus, but against him personally, alleging that his property violated county codes and represented a nuisance that was damaging her property values. The lawsuit demanded that Marcus relocate his garage at his own expense and sought $15,000 in damages for the alleged diminution of her property value caused by his violations. Can you imagine receiving that lawsuit notice? Can you picture the moment when harassment becomes something worse, something that could actually destroy your finances and your future? Marcus sat at his kitchen table, reading the lawsuit documents with shaking hands. This had gone far beyond HOA pettiness. This was a legal attack that could cost him tens of thousands of dollars to defend, potentially force him to sell his home, and damage his credit and financial stability for years. That night, Marcus made a decision. He was done playing defense. He was done trying to be reasonable with someone who had no interest in reason. It was time to go on the offensive, to expose Patricia's corruption, to fight back with everything he'd been quietly gathering for the past 2 years. He had documentation of every selective enforcement action. He had evidence of Patricia's procedural violations. He had survey reports proving she was wrong about the property boundaries. And he was about to discover something even more damaging, something that would blow this entire situation wide open. Because Marcus did something that, in retrospect, he should have done years earlier. He filed a public records request with the county for all permits, surveys, and property records related to Patricia's house and the original development of Willowbrook Estates. What came back would change everything. The box of records from the county arrived on a Wednesday morning. Marcus had taken the day off work specifically to review whatever he'd received. He spread the documents across his dining room table. Old plat maps, construction permits from when the neighborhood was developed in the 1990s, variance requests, inspection reports, and crucially the original boundary survey from when Patricia had purchased her home. Marcus started with the historical documents, working backward from present to past. Within an hour, he found the first major discrepancy. Patricia's fence, the tall cedar privacy fence that ran along the side of her property, had been installed without a permit. That by itself wasn't necessarily damning. Many homeowners did minor construction without proper permits, but it became more significant when he cross-referenced it with the original survey. According to the survey from when Patricia bought the house 12 years ago, the fence was clearly positioned 3 to 4 inches onto what should have been Marcus's property. This wasn't a matter of disputed measurements or conflicting surveys. The original survey, which Patricia would have received during her purchase, explicitly showed the property line, and her fence violated it. But that was just the beginning. As Marcus continued reviewing documents, a more disturbing pattern emerged. Patricia hadn't just built a fence in the wrong place. She'd conducted several modifications to her property over the years, and almost none of them had been done with proper permits or HOA approval. Her storage shed, the one that Bill the surveyor had noted might violate setback requirements, was actually worse than initially suspected. It had been built without a county permit, without HOA architectural approval, and according to the plat map, it was positioned almost 8 inches over the setback line. This wasn't a minor technical violation. It was a clear, substantial breach of the same rules Patricia had been trying to enforce against Marcus. Are you seeing the hypocrisy? Can you imagine the satisfaction Marcus must have felt as each piece fell into place? There was more. Patricia's driveway had been expanded at some point, adding about 4 feet of width on one side. No permit for that work appeared in the county records. Her detached garage, which she'd converted into a home gym, had electrical work done that should have required inspection. No inspection records existed. Marcus cross-referenced these findings with the HOA architectural approval records, which were public documents available to all homeowners. Patricia had never submitted applications for any of this work. She'd never sought approval from the Architectural Review Committee that she now chaired as HOA president. But the most explosive discovery was still to come. Marcus found a survey from 8 years ago, commissioned by Patricia herself, for reasons that weren't clear from the documents. This survey, conducted by a reputable firm, had explicitly noted several violations on Patricia's property, including the fence encroachment and the shed setback issue. Patricia had known. For 8 years, she'd known her property had violations. She'd had professional documentation of problems with her fence and shed. And then she'd become HOA president and spent years harassing Marcus about violations that didn't exist while sitting on documented evidence of her own actual violations. Marcus felt his hands trembling as he organized the documents. This wasn't just hypocrisy. This potentially rose to the level of fraud. Patricia had been collecting fines from him under pretenses while knowingly violating the same rules herself. But Marcus forced himself to stay calm and methodical. Emotion wouldn't win this fight. Documentation would. He spent the next 3 days organizing everything into a comprehensive report, cross-referencing dates, highlighting contradictions, and building a timeline that told an undeniable story. He made multiple copies of everything. He consulted with a real estate attorney who specialized in HOA disputes. The attorney's assessment was clear. Marcus had grounds not just to defend against Patricia's lawsuit, but to file counterclaims for harassment, abuse of process, and breach of fiduciary duty. More significantly, the attorney explained that HOA board members could be held personally liable when they abused their authority for personal reasons. If Marcus could prove Patricia had been targeting him as retaliation for exposing her initial mistake about the garage, and that she'd done so while knowingly sitting on violations of her own, she could face serious consequences. But here's what makes this moment so critical. Marcus had to decide how far he wanted to take this. Was it enough to defend himself, or was it time to ensure Patricia faced real accountability? Marcus thought about the 3 years of stress, the thousands of dollars in fines and legal fees, the anxiety every time he came home, wondering what notice would be waiting for him, the cultural artifact that his grandmother had given him, which Patricia had tried to force him to remove, the lawsuit that was still hanging over his head, threatening his financial stability. He thought about Jennifer and Tom and the other neighbors who'd finally spoken up at that meeting. He thought about how many other residents might have been quietly suffering under Patricia's arbitrary enforcement, too intimidated to fight back. Marcus made his decision. This wasn't just about him anymore. This was about stopping someone who'd corrupted a position of trust and weaponized it against her own neighbors. He prepared 2 packages. The first went to his attorney, containing everything needed to file a comprehensive counterclaim against Patricia's lawsuit. The second went to the HOA board members, with copies sent to every homeowner in the community via certified mail. The package to the homeowners was 30 pages long. It documented everything. Patricia's property violations, the 8-year-old survey she'd hidden every instance of selective enforcement Marcus could prove, the procedural violations where she'd assessed fines without proper board votes, and a detailed timeline showing how her harassment had escalated after Marcus presented evidence contradicting her initial accusation. Marcus didn't editorialize or make emotional appeals. He didn't need to. The documents spoke for themselves. He concluded with a simple statement. I am calling for a special meeting to vote on Patricia Drummond as removal from the HOA board and a full audit of all enforcement actions taken during her presidency. Can you imagine the explosion that followed? Can you picture Patricia's face when she realized what Marcus had done? The neighborhood erupted. Marcus's phone rang constantly with calls from other homeowners. Some shared their own stories of Patricia's enforcement actions, Violations they'd been fined for that seemed petty or selective. Others offered support, thanking Marcus for finally saying what many had been thinking. A few residents remained loyal to Patricia, arguing that strong enforcement was necessary to maintain property values. But they were in the minority, and their arguments grew weaker as more details emerged. The special meeting was scheduled for 2 weeks later. The HOA bylaws required such meetings to be held if requested by at least 20% of homeowners. Marcus had signatures from over 35%, a clear mandate for action. Patricia tried to prevent the meeting, arguing it was improperly called. When that failed, she tried to control the agenda. When that failed, she hired an attorney to represent her at the meeting. The attorney sent threatening letters to Marcus and several other vocal residents, suggesting that defamatory statements had been made and warning of potential legal consequences. But the threats rang hollow. Marcus had been scrupulous about only presenting factual, documented information. Truth was an absolute defense to defamation, and everything he'd shared was verifiable through public records. The night of the special meeting arrived. The small community center couldn't accommodate the crowd. Over 100 residents showed up, more than had attended any HOA meeting in the neighborhood's history. People stood along the walls, sat on the floor, and gathered outside the windows. Patricia sat in the front row next to her attorney, her posture rigid, her expression a mask of controlled fury. Marcus sat several rows back, clutching a folder with additional documentation, though he doubted he'd need it at this point. The board vice president, a mild-mannered accountant named Robert who'd served for 6 years, opened the meeting. He looked deeply uncomfortable. He explained that the board had received Marcus's documentation and had independently verified many of the claims. He stated that an emergency board meeting had been held 3 days earlier and that Patricia had been asked to resign voluntarily. She had refused. Robert's voice shook slightly as he continued. He explained that the board had voted in Patricia's absence from that emergency session to recommend her removal, subject to homeowner vote. 3 of the 4 other board members had voted in favor. Only 1 had abstained. Patricia's attorney stood to object, citing procedural grounds. But the homeowners weren't interested in procedure anymore. They wanted answers. Jennifer, the woman with the Virgin Mary statue, stood up. She asked Patricia directly, "Did you know about the violations on your own property when you filed complaints against Marcus?" Patricia's attorney advised her not to answer. The murmur through the crowd grew louder. Tom, the older man with the garden gnome collection, stood next. He'd done his own research after Marcus's package arrived. He asked, "Is it true you assessed over $15,000 in fines during your 3 years as president? But that only $4,000 of that amount was ever approved by board vote, as the bylaws require?" Again, Patricia's attorney instructed her not to respond. The crowd's displeasure became audible. "Can you feel the moment building? Can you sense what's about to break?" Then something unexpected happened. A young couple who lived 4 streets over stood up together. The wife spoke first. "We received 7 violation notices in the past 2 years. We paid over $900 in fines. After seeing Marcus's documentation, we reviewed our notices and realized 4 of those violations were assessed without board approval. We're demanding a refund." The husband continued. "We talked to our neighbors. We're not the only ones. There are at least 15 families who have similar situations. We're all demanding refunds, and we're considering legal action against the HOA for improper collection of fees." The room exploded with conversation. Multiple residents stood, shouting questions, sharing their own stories of excessive fines and selective enforcement. The meeting descended into controlled chaos. Patricia's attorney tried to adjourn the meeting, but Robert, showing unexpected backbone, refused. He called for order and moved directly to the vote on Patricia's removal. The vote wasn't even close. Of the homeowners present, 92 voted in favor of removal, 8 voted against, and 5 abstained. Patricia Drummond was no longer the HOA president. But the evening wasn't over. Several residents demanded to know what would happen with the fines they'd paid, the potentially improper assessments that had padded the HOA's accounts. Robert promised a full forensic audit by an independent accounting firm. Another resident asked about Patricia's lawsuit against Marcus. Would the HOA cover Marcus's legal defense, given that Patricia had apparently filed the suit based on false accusations while abusing her position? Robert looked at the remaining board members, then at Patricia's attorney, then back at the crowd. He took a deep breath and said something that would have been unthinkable just hours earlier. The board will retain counsel to explore all legal options, including potential counterclaims against any former board members who may have abused their positions. Patricia stood abruptly and walked out of the meeting, her attorney following behind. The crowd parted silently as she passed, creating a corridor of judgment that must have felt like the longest walk of her life. The aftermath of that meeting rippled through Willowbrook Estates for months. The forensic audit that Robert had promised wasn't just thorough, it was devastating for Patricia's legacy. The independent accounting firm spent 6 weeks reviewing 3 years of HOA financial records, enforcement actions, and board meeting minutes. Their 50-page report, which was shared with all homeowners, painted a picture of systematic abuse of authority that went far beyond what even Marcus had documented. Patricia had assessed over $18,000 in fines during her presidency. Of that amount, only 32% had been properly approved by board vote as required by the HOA bylaws. The rest had been unilateral decisions by Patricia herself, technically unauthorized by the governing documents. More troubling, the audit revealed financial irregularities. While there was no evidence of outright embezzlement, Patricia had used HOA funds for expenses that fell into gray areas. She'd hired her brother's landscaping company without competitive bidding. She'd expensed meals and travel to HOA conferences that weren't properly documented. She'd purchased office supplies and equipment that seemed excessive for an organization that operated primarily via email. Are you shocked yet? Because somehow it gets worse. The audit also uncovered Patricia's enforcement patterns, analyzing every violation notice issued during her presidency. The data was damning. Properties on her street received 68% more violation notices than properties on other streets. Homeowners who'd previously challenged HOA decisions received, on average, 3 times as many notices as homeowners who'd remained silent. Most significantly, the audit found 23 instances where Patricia had enforced rules against other properties for violations that existed on her own property. The hypocrisy wasn't just about Marcus's situation, it was systematic. The HOA's legal counsel reviewed the audit and delivered unwelcome news to the board. The association faced significant liability. Homeowners who'd been improperly assessed fines had grounds for refunds. Those who'd been targeted for selective enforcement might have claims for harassment, and the HOA's insurance might not cover these claims because they stemmed from intentional misconduct rather than simple negligence. The board made a difficult decision. They established a claims review process, inviting any homeowner who believed they'd been improperly fined to submit a request for reconsideration. Over 40 families filed claims. After reviewing each case, the board approved refunds totaling nearly $8,000. To cover these refunds and the cost of the audit, the board had to levy a special assessment on all homeowners of $150 each. This created another wave of anger, this time directed at Patricia for creating the mess in the first place. But here's the question on everyone's mind. What happened with Patricia's lawsuit against Marcus? The answer was swift and satisfying. Marcus's attorney filed a comprehensive motion to dismiss, attaching the survey reports, the public records documenting Patricia's own violations, and affidavits from multiple neighbors about the selective enforcement pattern. The motion argued that Patricia's lawsuit was a clear abuse of process, filed in retaliation for Marcus exercising his rights to defend against baseless HOA accusations. The judge assigned to the case granted the motion with unusual speed. In her written order, the judge noted that the lawsuit appeared to lack any factual or legal basis and suggested it may have been filed primarily for harassment purposes. She dismissed all of Patricia's claims with prejudice, meaning they couldn't be refiled. But Marcus wasn't satisfied with just defense. His attorney had filed counterclaims against Patricia personally for abuse of process, intentional infliction of emotional distress, and violation of her fiduciary duties as an HOA officer. These claims sought to hold Patricia personally accountable for the 3 years of harassment. Patricia's attorney tried to have the counterclaims dismissed, arguing that HOA officers should have immunity for actions taken in their official capacity, but the judge disagreed. She ruled that while HOA officers had qualified immunity for good faith enforcement actions, that immunity didn't extend to deliberate harassment or retaliation. The case moved into discovery, the phase where both sides could demand documents and depositions. Patricia was forced to produce all her HOA-related records, sit for a lengthy deposition, and answer detailed questions about her enforcement decisions. The deposition transcript, which Marcus later shared with interested neighbors, was fascinating. Patricia's attorney clearly struggled to explain her actions. Why had she commissioned multiple surveys of Marcus's property after the first one proved he complied? Why had she never addressed her own property violations despite having professional documentation of them? Why had she filed city code complaints about Marcus's property that city inspectors repeatedly found meritless? Patricia's answers were evasive and contradictory. She claimed she'd been acting to protect property values. She insisted her enforcement had been consistent. She denied that her actions were motivated by personal animus, despite the overwhelming documentary evidence showing she'd targeted Marcus far more than any other homeowner. Can you imagine sitting through that deposition? Watching someone who'd made your life miserable for years squirm under questioning about their own misconduct? Marcus's attorney also deposed the other board members. Their testimony was illuminating. 2 admitted they'd been uncomfortable with Patricia's focus on Marcus but had been afraid to challenge her. 1 described a board meeting where Patricia had become visibly angry, when another member questioned whether they should pursue additional action against Marcus. All confirmed that Patricia had frequently assessed fines without bringing them to board votes as required. As the case built toward trial, something shifted. Patricia's attorney approached Marcus's attorney with a settlement offer. Patricia would pay Marcus $15,000 to resolve all claims. She would formally apologize in writing. She would agree never to seek any position of authority in the Willowbrook HOA again. Marcus discussed the offer carefully with his attorney. On one hand, $15,000 would cover all his costs. The surveys, the legal fees, the improper fines, with some compensation for his emotional distress. On the other hand, accepting the settlement meant there would be no trial, no public accounting in court of what Patricia had done. But his attorney offered a perspective that Marcus ultimately found persuasive. You've already won. The neighborhood knows what she did. She's been removed from power. She's facing financial consequences. A trial would give you more vindication, but it would also cost you more time, more stress, and more energy focused on someone who's already been defeated. Sometimes the best revenge is taking the settlement and moving on with your life. Marcus considered it for a week. He thought about the 3 years of stress, the countless hours spent documenting violations and building his case. He thought about the satisfaction of exposing Patricia's corruption, and he realized his attorney was right. The settlement wasn't about letting Patricia off easy. It was about declaring victory and reclaiming his peace. He accepted the offer with one additional condition. The settlement agreement had to include a provision allowing him to share the terms with any Willowbrook homeowner who asked. Patricia's attorney pushed back hard on this point but ultimately conceded. The settlement was finalized in March 2022. But you might be wondering, what happened to Patricia after everything fell apart? The consequences extended far beyond the financial settlement. Patricia's reputation in the neighborhood was destroyed. Neighbors who'd once respected her organizational skills and attention to detail now saw those same traits as obsessive control and vindictiveness. Social invitations dried up. Conversations stopped when she approached. The community that had elected her president now treated her like a pariah. The stress took a visible toll. Patricia aged noticeably in those months. Neighbors reported seeing her outside less frequently. Her once immaculate lawn showed signs of neglect. The woman who'd been so concerned about property values and appearance seemed to have lost interest in her own property. 6 months after the settlement, a for sale sign appeared in Patricia's yard. She was leaving Willowbrook Estates, abandoning the neighborhood where she'd lived for nearly 13 years. Some neighbors felt a measure of sympathy. Others felt it was appropriate justice. Marcus felt mostly relief. Before Patricia moved, something unexpected happened. She came to Marcus's door on a Tuesday evening. He opened it cautiously, half expecting another confrontation. Instead, he found a woman who looked exhausted and defeated. Patricia didn't offer excuses or elaborate explanations. She said, "I was wrong about your garage. I should have admitted it when your first survey came back. Everything that happened after that was pride and stubbornness and refusing to acknowledge a mistake. I'm sorry for what I put you through." Marcus stood there, processing the apology he'd never expected to receive. It wasn't eloquent. It didn't undo the years of harassment, but it was sincere, and that counted for something. He nodded and said, "Thank you for saying that. I hope your next chapter is better than this one ended." Patricia nodded and walked away. 2 weeks later, she was gone. A young family with 3 children moved into her house that summer. They were friendly, easygoing, and completely uninterested in HOA politics. So what changed in Willowbrook Estates after Patricia's departure? Did the community learn from what happened? The answer is complicated but ultimately encouraging. The HOA underwent significant reforms. The new board, elected in a special election 6 months after Patricia's removal, implemented transparency measures and procedural safeguards designed to prevent future abuses of authority. All enforcement actions now require a formal board vote, properly documented in meeting minutes. Fines over $100 required a written justification explaining why the violation warranted the penalty. Homeowners gained the right to appear before the board to contest violations before fines were assessed. An independent ombudsman position was created to review complaints about selective enforcement. The board also commissioned a comprehensive review of all properties in the neighborhood, documenting existing violations without assessment of fines. This established a baseline and gave homeowners notice of issues that would need to be addressed during future property transfers. The goal was consistency and fairness rather than punishment. Perhaps most significantly, the board changed the culture around enforcement. The new president, a retired teacher named Maria who'd lived in Willowbrook for 15 years, made clear that the HOA's purpose was to serve homeowners, not control them. Rules would be enforced, but with common sense, flexibility, and an understanding that homes were places where people lived, not showcases that needed to be perfect at all times. Marcus became something of a neighborhood hero, though he never sought that role. Multiple residents thanked him privately for standing up to Patricia when they'd been too intimidated to do so. Some admitted they'd known Patricia was targeting him unfairly, but had been afraid that challenging her would make them the next target. Jennifer and Tom became close friends with Marcus. They'd bonded during the fight against Patricia's proposed covenant amendment, and that connection deepened into genuine friendship. They organized a neighborhood barbecue that summer, the first community social event not structured around HOA business in years. Over 60 residents attended. The atmosphere was relaxed, warm, and felt like what a neighborhood should be. But let's talk about the deeper implications of this story, because they extend beyond one woman's abuse of power in one suburban HOA. Marcus's experience illustrated something important about how power works in small organizations and voluntary associations. HOAs operate with minimal oversight. Board members have significant authority to interpret rules, assess fines, and impact their neighbors' lives. Most people join boards with good intentions, but some are drawn to these positions precisely because they offer power over others. Patricia's trajectory was instructive. She likely didn't start her presidency intending to become a vindictive tyrant. Her early actions, organizing cleanups, updating the website, negotiating better service contracts, genuinely served the community. But power, even small-scale power over a residential neighborhood, can corrupt people who lack internal checks on their behavior. When Marcus challenged Patricia's initial mistake about the garage setback, it threatened her authority and her self-image as someone who was always right. Rather than acknowledging the error, she doubled down. And with each escalation, backing down became harder. She'd invested too much of her identity in being right, in maintaining control, in winning this conflict. The psychological term is sunk cost fallacy, continuing a behavior because of previous investment rather than current merit. Patricia had invested so much energy in fighting Marcus that admitting she'd been wrong from the start would have required acknowledging years of wasted effort and unjustified harassment. Have you ever seen this pattern in your own life? Someone who can't admit they were wrong, so they keep escalating. Marcus's response was equally instructive. He could have given up and sold his house, which many people would have done. He could have matched Patricia's hostility with his own, creating a toxic cycle of retaliation. Instead, he chose systematic documentation and legal process. He built an airtight case patiently and methodically. When he finally went on the offensive, he did so with facts rather than emotion. The lesson isn't that everyone should fight every HOA dispute to the bitter end. Sometimes strategic retreat makes sense. But when someone is being genuinely wronged, when the harassment is systematic and the perpetrator is abusing institutional power, there's value in fighting back the right way. Marcus's victory created benefits beyond his personal situation. The reforms implemented after Patricia's removal made Willowbrook a better place for everyone. Future board members would think twice before abusing their authority. Homeowners knew they had recourse against unfair treatment. The association became what it should have been all along, a cooperative organization serving residents rather than controlling them. The financial costs were also instructive. Marcus spent approximately $7,000 total on surveys, legal fees, and related expenses fighting Patricia. But he recovered $15,000 in the settlement, plus he got refunds on the improper fines he'd paid. Financially, standing up to the bully was actually profitable, though that was never his primary motivation. More importantly, the 3 years of stress ended. Marcus's quality of life improved dramatically once Patricia was gone. He could come home without anxiety about what violation notice might be waiting. He could enjoy his property without feeling like he was under constant surveillance. The psychological value of that peace was immeasurable. So what's the larger takeaway from this story? What should people learn from Marcus's experience? First, document everything. In any dispute, especially one involving institutional power, contemporaneous documentation is crucial. Marcus's meticulous records, photos, dates, notes about every interaction provided the foundation for his case. Without that documentation, it would have been his word against Patricia's. Second, understand the rules and use them. Marcus studied the HOA bylaws and county regulations more carefully than Patricia did. He identified where she deviated from proper procedures. He used the association's own rules against her when she'd assumed no one would bother checking whether she was following them. Third, build coalitions carefully. Marcus didn't start by trying to turn the neighborhood against Patricia. He focused on his own situation first. But when other residents saw his documentation and recognized similar patterns in their own experiences, they joined his cause organically. Grassroots support emerged because the facts were compelling, not because Marcus was a master politician. Fourth, know when to accept victory rather than pursuing destruction. Marcus could have pushed for a trial, potentially exposing more of Patricia's misconduct publicly, but the settlement gave him financial compensation, an apology, and peace. Sometimes accepting the win is smarter than chasing vindication. Fifth, institutional checks matter. The reforms Willowbrook implemented after Patricia's removal required board votes, written justifications, and an appeals process. These weren't complicated or expensive measures, but they created accountability that hadn't existed before. Any organization with power over individuals needs similar safeguards. Have you ever dealt with an HOA dispute? Are you dealing with one right now? What lessons from Marcus's story might apply to your situation? It's worth noting that Marcus's story had several factors working in his favor that not everyone would have. He had the financial resources to hire surveyors and attorneys. He had the education and research skills to navigate legal documents and case law. He had the emotional resilience to endure years of harassment without cracking. And crucially, he was dealing with violations that were objectively disprovable. Either his garage was over the setback line or it was ant. Not every HOA dispute is so clear-cut. Some involve genuinely ambiguous rules or matters of aesthetic judgment where reasonable people can disagree. Some HOAs are better run than Patricia's and enforce rules more consistently, and some people genuinely do violate community standards in ways that warrant enforcement action. The lesson is, not all HOAs are bad, or all HOA board members abuse power. The lesson is that concentrated authority without oversight and accountability creates conditions for abuse. And when that abuse occurs, a systematic response beats an emotional reaction. Marcus's experience also highlighted something important about community dynamics. For years, other residents had witnessed Patricia's behavior but remained silent. Some had been victims themselves but were too intimidated to speak up. The culture of fear she created was almost as damaging as her direct actions. When Marcus finally broke that silence publicly, it created permission for others to share their experiences. This is a common pattern in institutional abuse situations. One person's willingness to go public creates psychological safety for others to come forward. The individual voices, once combined, became impossible to ignore. So where is Marcus today, 3 years after Patricia left the neighborhood? He's thriving. His property is well maintained, not because of HOA pressure, but because he takes pride in his home. The Chinese guardian lion still stands in his front yard, a symbol not just of his cultural heritage, but of his victory over arbitrary authority. He served on the HOA Architectural Review Committee for the past 2 years, helping ensure that rule enforcement remains fair and reasonable. His property value has actually increased substantially, not because of strict HOA enforcement, but because Willowbrook developed a reputation as a neighborhood with an engaged, reasonable association that protected homeowners rather than harassing them. Several families have specifically cited the reformed HOA structure as a reason for choosing to buy in the community. Marcus has also become an informal advisor to other homeowners facing HOA disputes in neighboring communities. He doesn't charge for this advice. He shares what he learned, the resources he found helpful, and the strategies that worked. He's helped several people navigate conflicts with their associations, sometimes preventing situations from escalating to Patricia-level toxicity. Most importantly, Marcus has his peace back. His home feels like a sanctuary again rather than a battlefield. He can focus on his career, his hobbies, his relationships, without the constant background anxiety of wondering what Patricia's next attack would be. That recovery of quality of life was worth every hour spent building his case. And what about the broader HOA community? Did Marcus's story have ripples beyond Willowbrook? Local media covered the story when Patricia's removal became public knowledge. The headline in the county newspaper read, "HOA President Ousted After Homeowner Exposes Selective Enforcement." The article, while brief, captured the essential facts and sparked discussion about HOA governance and accountability. Several other HOAs in the region read about the case and proactively implemented similar reforms to what Willowbrook adopted. A local attorney who specialized in HOA law started offering seminars on fiduciary duties and proper enforcement procedures, using Patricia's case as a cautionary example of what not to do. A state legislator even introduced a bill that would require HOAs to maintain detailed records of all enforcement actions and make those records available to homeowners upon request. The bill did not ultimately pass. The state's HOA Lobbying Association opposed it as too burdensome, but it sparked conversations about accountability and transparency that continue today. Marcus's story became something of an urban legend in local HOA circles, told as both a warning and an inspiration. To board members, it was a reminder that abusing authority would eventually have consequences. To homeowners, it was proof that fighting back against unfair treatment was possible, that bullies with a gavel weren't invincible. The cultural impact extended to online communities as well. Marcus wrote a detailed post about his experience on a popular HOA dispute forum, outlining his strategy and sharing the documentation tactics that proved most effective. That post has been viewed over 50,000 times and has been referenced in dozens of other homeowners' fights against their associations. So, what's the ultimate message? What should you take away from this entire saga? Marcus Chen's battle with Patricia Drummond wasn't just about property lines or garage setbacks. It was about power, accountability, and what happens when institutions designed to serve communities become tools for personal vendettas. It was about the importance of standing up to bullies, even when the fight seems daunting. And it was about the satisfying justice that comes when someone who's been abusing authority finally faces consequences. Patricia probably never expected meaningful resistance. Most people, when faced with institutional harassment, give up and move away. They pay the unjust fines, remove the unoffending decorations, and accept defeat because fighting seems too expensive, too time-consuming, too stressful. Patricia counted on that capitulation. She'd built her reign of terror on the assumption that no one would dare challenge her systematically enough to threaten her position. But Marcus did challenge her, not with aggression or emotion, but with patience, documentation, and strategic use of the very rules Patricia claimed to enforce. He turned her weapon, the HOA's regulatory structure, against her by proving she'd violated the standards she demanded from others. The personal cost to Patricia was severe: reputation destroyed, settlement paid, forced to leave her home and community. Some might feel that's excessive, that she was just an overzealous volunteer who made mistakes. But remember, she had 8 years of documented knowledge about her own violations while she harassed Marcus for violations that didn't exist. She filed a frivolous lawsuit designed to devastate a neighbor financially. She collected thousands of dollars in unauthorized fines from multiple families. These weren't mistakes. They were deliberate abuses of power. The personal gain for Marcus was profound: vindication, financial compensation, and recovery of his quality of life. But perhaps more importantly, he established a precedent that would protect future residents from similar abuse. The reforms implemented after Patricia's removal would benefit homeowners for decades to come. Here's a final question to consider. If you found yourself in Marcus's position, would you have the courage to fight back? Or would you be among the silent majority who witnessed the abuse but said nothing? There's no shame in either answer. Not everyone has the resources, skills, or emotional capacity to wage the kind of campaign Marcus did. But his story proves that fighting back is possible, that documentation and persistence can defeat institutional bullies, and that sometimes the person who seems all-powerful is actually standing on a foundation of lies that will crumble when exposed to truth. Marcus's Chinese guardian lion still stands in his front yard, weathering through seasons and years. It's just a statue, carved from stone, that represents traditional symbolism about protection and prosperity. But to Marcus and his neighbors, it means something more. It's a reminder that some battles are worth fighting, that standing your ground against unfair authority is not just possible, but necessary, and that communities thrive when power is held accountable. Patricia is gone, living somewhere else, presumably more carefully about what positions of authority she seeks. The neighborhood she once controlled with arbitrary enforcement and intimidation now runs smoothly under fair, transparent governance. Property values are up. Neighbors are friendlier. The community functions as it should have all along. And Marcus? He's home. Really, truly home in a way he couldn't be for those 3 years of harassment. He's barbecuing with neighbors on weekends. He's working from his home office without fear that Patricia will file complaints about his business usage. He's maintaining his property because he takes pride in it, not because he's terrified of fines. He's living the dream he'd worked 15 years to achieve, the peaceful suburban life that seemed so simple until a vindictive HOA president made it a nightmare. Justice doesn't always prevail in HOA disputes. Some homeowners lose these battles, crushed by the costs or worn down by the stress. Some HOA tyrants remain in power for years or resign quietly without facing real consequences for their abuses. Marcus's story isn't universal. It's the exception that proves the rule about how difficult these fights can be. But it's an exception worth studying, worth sharing, worth learning from. Because embedded in his 3-year ordeal and eventual triumph are lessons about documentation, patience, coalition building, strategic thinking, and knowing when to fight and when to settle. These lessons apply far beyond HOA disputes. They're relevant to any situation where someone faces institutional power being wielded unfairly against them. The question isn't whether you'll ever face a Patricia in your life. Statistically, most people will encounter someone who abuses small-scale authority at some point. The question is whether you'll have the tools, knowledge, and determination to respond effectively when that moment comes. Marcus's story provides a roadmap. Not every detail will apply to every situation. Still, the core principles remain constant. Document relentlessly. Understand the rules better than your opponent, build your case methodically, choose your battles strategically, and never let someone else's abuse of power make you abandon what's rightfully yours. 3 years of hell, followed by justice and peace. That's not a small victory. That's everything that matters when someone tries to take your home, your community, and your quality of life. Marcus didn't just win a property dispute. He reclaimed his life, reformed a broken system, and set an example that will help others facing similar battles for years to come. And somewhere in Willowbrook Estates, on a quiet street lined with oak trees, a Chinese guardian lion stands watch over a home where peace has finally been restored. That statue, once the target of vindictive enforcement, now stands as a monument to the power of standing your ground against injustice. Sometimes the bullies win, but not always. Not when someone has the courage, patience, and determination to fight back the right way. Marcus proved that, and in doing so, he created a story worth telling, worth remembering, and worth learning from. So what will you do when your moment comes? Will you be ready? Have you experienced something similar with your HOA? What would you have done differently in Marcus's position? Share your thoughts and stories in the comments below. Your experience might help someone else facing a similar situation right now.